We are talking about a career that spans some 47 years, 19 years here at WABC alone, and a man who has spoken to countless amounts of celebrities. And today, it is your turn to have the spotlight put on you, Sandy. We're so glad to have you here. Although we're not saying really goodbye, you'll be moving on to other parts of the company, you're leaving us as on air. And when you look back right now, what are your thoughts?
Well, one of the things that is uppermost in my mind, David, is the wonderful conversations that you and Liz and I have had during the commercial breaks that the viewers never get. One of my fondest memories is of racing to finish a story before the floor director says, "You're on air again." So that's what I remember. The other thing I remember is I worked at CNN in a very rough and tumble part and time in this business when people were very competitive. And when I got to Eyewitness News and I did my first live shot, I swear about a dozen people in the newsroom said, "Hey, great live shot." And that was very unusual for me.
So nice.
Right. And that spirit of camaraderie has continued. And that's what I'm going to remember long after I leave here.
You know, you talk about your experience at Eyewitness News. You just mentioned CNN. Before that, radio. Let's go back even further in your life. How did it get started?
Well, when I was 9 years old, I walked out of my building at 165 East 72nd Street on the Upper East Side, and there was a film crew shooting a school bus. And it was the opening of a movie called The World According to Henry Orient, starring Peter Sellers. Now, he wasn't there that day, but there was a whole crew, and the bus pulled in, and the camera dollied in, and I thought, okay, I want that.
I want that. I'm hooked.
Then when I moved to California, in my day, you could not really get on a lot, let alone get a job, if you didn't have family in the business or know somebody. And I went to school with people whose parents were in the picture business, and that's how I got on the lot for the first time, carrying coffee at Paramount when I was 16 years old.
What is amazing to me is that your career really gets formulated, from my understanding of it, in radio. How did you get into radio, and what kind of an impact did it have on your career?
I met a guy who was a prodigy in college, Garth Anseer, and he had invented this national radio show, which was kids asking famous people questions on location. Now, when I met him, it was mainly people in Washington, in the political sphere, some business people, and I got involved with the organization and branched out so that when I got out of school, my resume said simply, as a panelist on Focus on Youth, that was the name of the radio show, I have interviewed the following people. And it was a list of like 50 people that you knew. And people would look at that, and that's how I got an interview at CNN, and I was the last person hired before CNN went on the air.
Well, this is the first day for the cable news network.
My hire date was May 12th. CNN went on June 1st, 1980, and I was the producer and writer for Bernard Shaw, and he was my mentor.
What was it like to work for Ted Turner?
Ted Turner used to say to me, "I know the names of 6 people that work for me at CNN, and you're one." And that defined our relationship. The term visionary, Dave, is really overused, I think. Everybody's a visionary, it seems now. I knew a true visionary, and that was Ted Turner. He could see the future. And I would have these dinners with Ted where he would just go on monologues lasting an hour. You think I talk a lot. Oh, my God.
And wasn't it on your radio show that you also met your, at the time, future wife?
Yeah, I did, because what happened was, because I had 3 hours to fill every day, I called the publishers in New York and said, "Put your authors on with me and I'll wake them up." And actually, Alan Dershowitz was my first interview, and he said, "That guy's like my 4th cup of coffee." And as a result, I got all these authors like Stephen King and so forth. And one of them was my wife-to-be, Eileen Googe.
Oh,
and I had a point of reading every book of every author, but on the day that she appeared, hers was the only book I never read. But in the end, I read it later, and we're married. That was 28 years ago.
Got a lot of reading that you caught up with after that.
Absolutely.
Work. And she's such a celebrated author. But it's your turn right now. Fortunately for us, about 19 years ago, someone here at the station decided we needed to have you part of the team. Tell me about that experience, and what did you do?
Well, I was on 1010 Wins Radio at the time.
This is 1010 Wins.
Great thing about all news radio is that you learn how to write really, really fast. Yeah. The news director said, go to the Oscars and give me something.
Right.
Now, years ago, I had developed a friendship with the late Gil Cates, a man who produced more Oscars than any other person. And I just called him up and said, Gil, I need. And he said, Sandy, you got. And I hired my own...
Such a Hollywood line.
I hired my own crew. We went, and Gil was as good as his word. He introduced me to the host that year, Chris Rock, who gave me a few vital seconds of sound.
Backstage at Hollywood's Kodak Theater, Rock is relaxed and still causing controversy.
I have a care in the world. We'll go out, smoke some dope, and get ready for the show.
There you go.
He took me on stage to show me the set. Now, as a result of that, you can't do that anymore. There was a sort of a decision afterwards that...
the Kenyon rule.
You can't see the set until the curtain lifts in the early seconds of the Oscar broadcast. But he took me up there and we shot it all, we cut it all together, and I didn't tell anybody what I had.
It's much closer than it looks on TV. The biggest fear of every winner? Tripping on these steps.
I just said, I'll be there on Friday morning, and I rolled this piece, and I must say the results were highly satisfactory, and I've been here ever since.
Oh my goodness, what a hire. They were like, what did you just do? What did you just give us? Thank you very much, Sandy. We're still thanking you. And let's talk about some of the celebrities you've met along the way. And I know there's a couple of them being special, like Jennifer Garner, right?
Jennifer Garner is just the sweetest person. And here's a story that illustrates that perfectly. I was still basically freelance here. So I was still making my way, and it was a time of one of those very rare strikes on Broadway, where Broadway was shut down. And I was here just a couple of weeks, and the strike gets settled. Now, I have an interview with Jennifer Garner, who had been appearing in Cyrano on stage. And it was before digital. It was the last days of tape. And I did the interview with her, and would you mind if I asked about the strike? Oh, absolutely not. And she was just terrific. Then, for the first and only time in my career, the technician runs in and says, we didn't record that.
Oh, no.
And I looked stricken. And she said, don't worry, we'll do it again.
Oh.
And I thought, what a relief. But then she said, but there's something that's bothering me, Sandy. Your makeup's all wrong. And the next thing I knew, one of the most beautiful women and most famous in the country was just carefully doing my makeup.
Wow.
The star did the makeup. She did it again. She did it better. And she endeared herself to me ever since. I've had Hugh Jackman sing a song to me. From 2 feet away, 3 feet away, that is amazing.
Not bad.
And I have to say, Matt Damon has done really a lot for me. One time when Emily Blunt was coming up, they were doing a movie together. And as I was leaving from interviewing Emily with Matt, he turned to her and said, do you know who that guy is? And she goes, frankly, I don't. And he said, well, you should get to know him because his reports in the taxi cab really made a difference for Ben Affleck's first film. So ever since then, when I see Emily Blunt, she greets me like a long-lost relative.
Oh, my goodness.
And it was also one of the most satisfying moments because, and my former employer happened to be at the door of another junket when Matt Damon said, will you give us a minute? Now, let me tell you, David, when a star says, will you give us a minute?
Yeah.
Basically, the world stops. People freeze. It's just uncanny. And he turns to me, he says, listen, my eldest daughter is a big fan of yours in the cabs. And if we don't get a picture, she won't believe that I met you.
Are you kidding me?
Isn't that nice?
That is amazing. I love the stories where it's not just you talking to some of the celebrities, but you actually being part of their lives. Didn't you give Brie Larson some advice along the way when she was starting out?
So Brie Larson, before her huge superstardom in the Marvel movies, did a picture called Room, which is great. If you haven't seen it, it's a small piece. It's just a mother and a child trapped in a room.
Right.
And that's established her and earned her an Oscar nomination. Now, sometimes when you're nominated for an Oscar, you're not even an Academy member. You can't vote. And I can remember literally being downstairs in the dressing room that Live uses and her asking me, so how does the Academy work? And I literally took her through who votes, how you get in, and all of this stuff. And it was wonderful to, having had that conversation, then watch her go into the stratosphere.
Wow. Well,
That's
just
very
great because you
satisfying.
get to watch the whole arc of it. It's not just even the current stars. One of the greats, Henry Fonda, somehow, when you were younger, this is now we're going back a couple of years, right? You were able to snag an interview that no one else could get. Tell me about this.
Now we're going back to college days and the show Focus on Youth and Garth Anseer. Garth was a guy who ended up running networks. He started something called The Ricky Lake Show, which was a big hit, and he has done very well. But he was like a prodigy. He had invented this radio show, which had students interviewing people. And I figured out, why not interview Henry Fonda? And we got to his home. We were supposed to tape for about a half hour. And he said at the end of one reel that went by like that, oh, I've devoted my whole afternoon to this. And one of the most interesting things he told me was that he never would have gotten into acting except for the next door neighbor in Omaha, Nebraska. That next door neighbor, a frustrated actress who was the mother of Marlon Brando.
Oh my God.
So
That's
both
his
of them-
connection to
right,
them.
That's right.
Oh my God.
And so when I got finished with that interview, he looked at me and said, we've really done a lot about my life today. And I came down, it was as simple as this. If I can get that old guy, because I was 22 at the time, to tell me that stuff, maybe I could do this business.
The thing that stuck out, you've told me this story before, and I wanted to share it with everybody, was how you got him to talk about love and how he's unable to express love, and how that later on became a discussion with Jane Fonda, no less.
Yes, and what happened was that he never said the words, I love you, to his own children until the last week of his life. That was a couple of years later after this interview. And he talked about that and some of his difficulty about how he had grown up in a home where that was never said to him. And I really got the sense there that you were getting the real person. And then after that, he took us down below his house to his orchard. Now, the orchard is not in any book. You cannot look about it on the internet. It just was a private space. And for a long time, I took a picture with him, and for a long time, that was the only picture of a celebrity on my wall. Because I look down on people who have got pictures with everybody, you know. And now...
You're like, oh, wait, I got to put this one up.
So that went on for years. I never took pictures with celebrities because when I was coming up as a young man, that was for fans.
Right.
So one day the news director calls me in and says, there's something called social media and you got to get your picture taken with everybody from now on. So I go, okay, good timing. It was the press junket for Les Miserables. So Hugh Jackman's one of the nicest people in the world. And so I go, Hugh, I don't usually take these pictures, but would you mind? He goes, of course. So then I go over to Anne Hathaway and I go into this long windup about, I don't really do this, but they're asking me now. It's kind of part of my job. Would you mind? And taking a picture? And she just looked at me and said, actually, I would mind, so no.
You're like, oh.
And I've always said, Dave, one of the toughest things is to deal with big star displeasure. And here's why. Because you have all of that charisma coming at you somewhat negatively. It's hard.
Yeah, it's a lot. Elizabeth Taylor. I don't want to leave this without, this man had a relationship with Elizabeth Taylor, and that alone should tell you everything. What was the first time you met her?
I met Elizabeth Taylor when she was married to John Warner. And in Washington, D.C., and you never got past the eyes with Elizabeth Taylor. They were infinite shades of violet. I never, ever saw a motion picture or a still picture that did them justice. You just had to be there. My favorite Elizabeth Taylor was at the Oscars one year when I was locked up right after the telecast had happened, and I was due downstairs for a CNN Live shot, and I literally ran down a hallway trying to get out, and there was a freight elevator, and it opened, and I fell right on my behind, right in front.
How graceful of it.
And it was not graceful, David. It was not graceful. And I looked up, and one of the world's most famous hands extended, and the most famous jewel was dangling.
The diamond.
And, the diamond, the Burton diamond, biggest
Right.
in the world. And I heard the soft voice saying, Sandy, where the blank is the fire?
She could curse, couldn't she?
Yes, she could.
Given the chance.
And speaking of, my favorite story about that is, I used to ask the same question, which is, what were you thinking to a winner at the moment that they called your name?
Right.
And I asked that of Gwyneth Paltrow when she won for Shakespeare in Love. She just looked at me and said, I was thinking, holy blank. Now, she said the
Does
word...
it rhyme with hit?
No, she said the word blank, so you could use it on television.
Smart.
We know what she meant,
Right.
but she said blank.
Smart.
And those spontaneous moments
Right.
are really what you live for, those moments when the facade goes down.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons I love Oscars. People say you've done 37 Oscars. Does it ever get old? It never does. I'll tell you why. It never gets old watching people and meeting them a few minutes after their lives have changed. That's what makes it, particularly for winners.
It's historic.
That is what makes it. And the one thing that no one knows about, unless you're there, is how nervous everybody is on that red carpet beforehand. There is a real tension of nerves.
People focus on the glamorous side and you're meeting all these big name celebrities, but the reality is you're on deadline. You have to deal with these breaking news stories. That's one of the critical parts of your responsibility with Eyewitness News, and you've done so many of them fabulously. One of them that comes to mind is Heath Ledger when he passed away.
Heath Ledger was early in my tenure at Eyewitness News, and he was found dead. And the news director said, you got to get up there on live TV until Lucy Yang can get to the house with a live crew. That was about 25 minutes up there.
Little song and dance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was really interesting because you're communicating and you're trying to make people understand why this is so important. This was a guy who died at the peak.
Why so serious?
It was a tragedy. You have to hit the right tone. And I did go back to my mentor, Bernard Shaw, who covered the assassination attempt against Ronald Reagan while I was his producer, sort of passing up notes to him. And he was on about 20 hours continuously on that occasion. So I tried to sort of channel what I learned that day.
You know, Sandy, one of the things I think that surprised a lot of people was the success of the taxi cabs, and you're part of it, your role in it.
It has surprised me, I have to tell you. It has been a wonderful gift. Once I was in the cab, stars started saying, the taxi cab guy. Publicists started offering me good stories, saying, can we be in the cabs? And yes, even a few stars called me and said, how do I get in the cab? This is my final appearance on Taxi TV. It started as something extra. It was extra work. There are 6,000 of them. It's a slightly different audience, and for that reason, everything in the cab has to be G-rated.
If you look back at your career at Channel 7 and before that on the air as an entertainment reporter, how do you want to be remembered?
Well, I think the main story that I've covered that means the most to me is what appears now to be a genuine move towards diversity in Hollywood, in show business, and in movies and television.
This is actually a historical moment. So I really have to thank the Academy for acknowledging, embracing diversity and true representation.
I mentioned I was 9 years old when I saw my first crew in action, and I remember it vividly. It was all white men, a single female besides the two performers, a single female who was known as, her official title was Script Girl. Today it's called Continuity, but then it was Script Girl, and that's it. Now, I entered the business. I went to cover the business. I spent decades in the business, and the crew, composition of that crew never seemed to change. And I got to know a woman at Paramount, Cheryl Boone. Cheryl Boone was an executive, a publicity executive, and she was one of two executives who were African American. The other was her brother. And Ashley Boone had been the person who said, when they wanted to bury the original Star Wars, no, you got something here. You should really go wide with this. So after that, he was respected. He was one, his sister was another, 2 black executives. And there was a movement towards diversity in the 80s where we thought, wow, this is changing. You know, Spike Lee was coming up. There were other directors where you thought, okay, changed in the wind. But as we know, it would be Oscars So White decades later.
Well, I'm here at the Academy Awards, otherwise known as the White People's Choice Awards.
That finally changed it. This hashtag, after all of the nominations in the acting categories were white.
The Academy Motion Pictures Arts and Sciences committed to doubling the number of people of color and doubling the number of women within their ranks by 2020. And in fact, they did that.
And now to see this genuine movement, and we're not there yet, and others speak powerfully to the slowness of the change.
We are literally demanding to be seen.
But to see genuine diversity where you can go and sit with Cheryl Boone Isaacs, as she is known now, and sit when she was president of the Academy in the Academy boardroom. And I just looked at her after all of the controversy had abated. It was about 6 months later. And I said, is this genuine? And she says, I think it's going to really happen this time.
The anger comes from years of feeling excluded.
That's been the most important story I covered. I tried to cover that as diligently as possible, but it's really a challenge to people now who come after me. Is this going to be a false start, yet another false start, or is it going to be a genuine change? And I am hopeful, but I leave it to others to determine if the pace of change is acceptable.
Well, thank you for all you did there. Thank you for what you did here at Channel 7. And I am going to miss having you in the building every day, enjoying our company, our stories behind the scene, and waiting between the commercials, chit-chatting about the next thing coming up. You know, wishing you best in the next chapter of your career. And thank you. Thank you for all you've done here at Channel 7.
Before we go, David, I just have to say I did come up in a very rough and tumble time in this business. You have welcomed me and you have made me feel at home from moment one here, and I'll never forget it.
Well, it's my pleasure, and I'm just one of many that feel the way about you as well.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.